up the technological solutions also. Is that okay? Can people at the back hear me okay? Okay. And feel free to kind of signal to me if I end up whispering. Okay. So welcome everybody. It's good to see so many familiar faces. I know that some of you are here because you're part of my class on Wednesdays regularly. Oh, that's better. Thank you, Yardana. Now it's okay, right? Okay, I don't need to raise my voice. Wonderful. So some of you are here with me every Wednesday and we're learning about natural elements. Some of you are here for Chanukah. Don't worry, today's class is not going to rely on knowledge from previous classes in this course, but I will mention, and that will be really my beginning point, that we've spent several weeks already with my students learning about fire in Tanakh. And we saw, I could say, two types of manifestation of fire. Fire as a part of God's revelation. Think Brit Bein HaBetarim, think Mount Sinai, think the burning bush. And we talked about fire as the fire that consumes the offering on the altar in Vayikra and onwards. And one thing we can say that's both of those types of fire have in common is that if we view our relationship with God as a conversation, that fire, both the fire in the revelation that is not real fire, doesn't burn anything, and the fire on the altar that very much is a burning fire, that's its purpose, to burn things, to consume things, both of them on some deep level represent God's side of the conversation. In other words, it's God's revelation. It's God accepting or signaling his acceptance of our offering. It's God signaling his presence amidst us by having fire on the altar, by having the pillar of fire, by having a fire in various forms participate in our life. In other stories in Tanakh, which we didn't discuss at all in our course so far, fire is also God's emissary. You know, God uses fire to destroy stone. God uses fire to summon Eliyahu back to him when he decides that Eliyahu finished his run as his prophet, and he sends a chariot of fire. But this is not what we're going to talk about today. The fire we're going to talk about today is the fire that represents our side in our conversation with God, and therefore a distinctly different path within Judaism, because we're not talking now about feeling awe, feeling submission, acknowledging God. Even we're talking about what we can do, where we come into the story, and how the fire, in particular, the flames of the menorah in the Mikdash, in a sense, direct us in this path, show us how to take this path, show us what it's supposed to be, but also spread their light, spread this message of what we can do, what we should do, far beyond the menorah, far beyond the Mikdash, far beyond Israel, really, and through the lights of Chanukah for all the generations to come. So that's just to give us a little bit of a sense of where we're aiming. And before we get there, I want to start with the basics. What is the menorah? What are the lights of the menorah? What are we trying to achieve when we light the lights of the menorah? And the truth is that there's two places in the Chumashim where the menorah is kind of front and center, and when we learn about what exactly we're supposed to do with it. One is in the source sheet before you. Does anybody not have the source sheet, by the way? I have, okay. In the source sheet before you, I brought both of those sources. In box number 1, there's in Shmot, when God gives the instruction for the creating for the building and creation of the Mishkan, he also gives instructions for the creation of the menorah. And then later, as we will see in Bamidbar, in the midst of the description of Chanukah Mishkan, there's another special reference to the menorah, and we'll get to that in a second. Let's start with the first source. I'm in Shmot Kaf Hey Lamed Aleph. I'll read in the Hebrew. The English is right before you as well. It's the first source in the first box. Ve'asita menorat zahav tahor miksha te'aseh, made out of pure gold, out of one piece of gold. המנורה, ירחה וקנה, גביעיה, כפתוריה ופרחיה, ממנה יהיו. ושישה קנים, ל"ב, יוצאים מצידיה, 3 קני מנורה מצידה האחד, ו3 קני מנורה מצידה השני. And it goes on and on and on to describe in detail exactly what the menorah is supposed to look like. And it goes back to emphasize once more that it's supposed to be made of one piece. In Pasuk Lamed Vav 36, כפתוריהם ופנותם ממנה יהיו כולה, מקשה אחת, זהב טהור. So before we even talk about the flames, before we get to the fire part and our job or the Kohanim's job in lighting that fire, the first thing we know about the menorah, namely the vessel for this fire, is that it has to come from a place of unity. There has to be, in the material composition of it, in the process and the history that creates it, there has to be unity. Why do you think that's important? What is it? Why is that so emphasized? Anybody wants to share a thought, an opinion, an idea? Yes.
Otherwise we'll kill each other.
Okay, so otherwise we'll kill each other. So you're already jumping to the metaphorical, right? You're already transposing this conversation from the physical menorah to the idea that somehow the menorah is supposed to represent us, and it's important that we're unified. So I agree, and the Mefarshim definitely go in that direction. I don't want to get quite that far yet. Let's stay still within the ritual, but we will definitely touch base with that. Yes.
I just think that truth and light,
Mm-hmm.
it's all one. And the different branches and the different
Mm-hmm.
ways of interpreting.
So you're saying, I'm just going to repeat so everybody hears, you're saying that truth and light are one. And there's branches, there's details.
And they're depending on your perspective. And
Mhm.
everything else, right?
So you're,
Just
okay.
like
So
everything's one.
you're saying that since the menorahs, I'll reframe it a little bit and elaborate, but thank you. You're saying that since the menorah has to do with light in particular, even though so far we didn't really touch the light yet, we're just in the material composition, but still, the purpose of it is obviously the candles
Also the gold.
and the gold the gold that's shiny and sparkly and
I mean, not necessarily, but
yeah.
the pure.
It's pure, right? We'll touch upon the idea of purity in a second. Light we associate with truth, with knowledge. Truth is one, even if the way we see it, the way we experience it, the way we perceive it might differ. And that is definitely within our tradition of interpretation. That's definitely been one of the strong emphases in the analysis of the menorah. Just a second, that it's the idea that light represents truth, specifically less truth and more spirit. It's like God's spirit in the world. And there's this idea that we encounter God's spirit in many ways and we experience it in many ways, but we have to understand that it's one. God is not broken apart by the many manifestations of his chesed or his presence in the world. And we need to, in a sense, the menorah invites us almost to meditate upon it as we encounter God's spirit in our life, as we think of God's truth in our life, to meditate upon the unifying concept behind it. Yes.
Also, if it's a one piece of pure gold, then hopefully there's less of a chance of one piece breaking off. I mean, it also, not only God, but Am Yisrael is a unified whole that hopefully one piece can be broken off and will remain a whole intact, integral.
So I like your point. You're making a nice connection between the integrity of the artifact, namely that because you made it out of one piece, it's less likely to break off. And you're tying it to those metaphorical meanings of Am Yisrael and God, and saying that we don't want a part of Am Yisrael to fall off. We don't want part of God's presence in the world to fall off. And by creating it as a unified artifact, milchatchila, from the get-go, from the material level, not just cobbling it together and forcing it together, but finding something that's one. And from that one, opening the many represents the right order of the world, both in relation to Am Yisrael and in relation to God. One last comment, and then we'll continue. I'll reopen it to discussion in a second. Yes.
See that God created goes forward.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the menorah represent the four. Give us some of it.
I'm so happy you brought that up. You're saying that the first thing God created, right? Vayehi, oh, menorah is or. And oh, there's some unity then. It's before God created many distinctions, light and darkness, day and night, sky and earth, water and dry places. It just light. That's the one thing that is at first. There's beyond God himself, obviously. There's light. And the menorah captures some of that unity in its service to light. And by the way, I'll get to you in a second, okay? Midrash Lekachtov, if you look in the second source, brings the Bria really into the menorah, saying, Ve'asita et nerotea shiv'a, and you made 7 candles, keneged shiv'at yemei bereshit. So something about the creation of the menorah, just as you said, just as the Midrash Lekachtov says, is supposed to reflect this primary experience of creation, that the kind of the very foundations of the world. And the question is, and then what? Okay, so we recreate this artifact, I don't know, this thing out of one piece of gold. We, through the creation process, we represent our understanding that God is one and Am Yisrael is one, even if it has many manifestations and whistles and bells and all that. And then what do we do with it? What kind of light are we meant to bring into the world with it? Is it meant to be a reflection of God's light? Is it just meant to represent the light of the first day? So we will now go one layer up and look at the lighting of the light itself. But you wanted to comment? No? Okay. So in Shmot, God and Moshe really focus on the creation of the menorah and its specifications. And then at a later time, in Bamidbar, in the middle of the description of Chanukah Mishkan, by the way, the second description, there's one description in Vayikra and there's another description in Bamidbar. And we'll get to that in a second, why that is and how they differ, what they add to one another. But in the midst of the description of Chanukah Mishkan in Bamidbar, suddenly God makes what looks like a non sequitur comment, because he's just finished, the Torah finishes describing the korbanot, the nesi'im, the heads of the tribes, the chieftains of the tribes bring as part of Chanukah Mishkan, each of them bringing their own gifts, all of which are the same, but the best that they have to the Mishkan. There's a long description that it says, this one brought this one brought this, even though all the discs are the same. Like they all brought the same gifts that are the best they could bring. And then it's about to go into a description of how God consecrates the Levi'im to the work in the Mishkan. And in a non sequitur sort of moment that doesn't quite fit and causes some discomfort to the commentators who are trying to dig it up and understand what's going on there, God interjects a comment that has to do with the lighting of the light, taking it from artifact level to practice, ritual level. So I'm at the bottom of box number 1. And this is the famous beginning of Parashat Be'alotcha. Vayedaber Hashem el Moshe le'emor. Daber el Aharon, ve'amarta elav. Beha'alotcha et hanerot, el mul pnei amenorah, ya'iru shivat hanerot. When you mount the lamps, which, by the way, might not be the best translation, but let's go with it. Let the 7 lamps give light at the front of the lampstand. Most Parshanim understand it to mean that the lamps, the kanim, the candles need to somehow turn towards the shamash. The shamash is the central candle, right? So the other lights need to somehow join it. They can't just like each light be, each ptila pointing in a different direction. There has to be a feeling of the lights coming together. In other words, when God makes a comment, not just about the creation of the menorah, but about how to use it, once again, the theme of unity is central. It's not enough that the artifact, that the material reality of it is one. The form of it, the way the light goes, need to create one light. Sforno, by the way, when he talks about that, when he analyzes this pasuk, he says that this is supposed to represent our dedication to God. and how we all dedicate everything to God, and how we all dedicate, I should say it differently. Each of us should dedicate all of our different powers and aspects to God. And all of us as a people have to dedicate ourselves to God so that we come together. In other words, as Forno reads it, the light of the menorah, the flames of the menorah, it's not just that they represent our side of the conversation with God on some personal level, that this is a light we bring to him. They're supposed to represent the totality of ourselves, the totality of everything we bring into this conversation. Let's see it in the Sforno very briefly. It's one source up, still in box number 1. The Musar, allegorical lesson conveyed by the lights of the menorah is that only by the right side, representing preoccupation with eternal values, life in the future, working together with the left side, which represents the concerns with physical life on our planet. I'm not going to go into his typology. We will be able to attain our purpose on earth. Our sages in Hulin 92 phrased it thus: if not for the input from celestial regions, spiritual input, the creatures on earth would not be able to survive at all. In order for this universe to function as God wanted it to, all social levels of the people have to make their respective contributions. A major function of this combined activity by the tutored and the ignorant is to ensure that God's name would be hailed, revered, and enthusiastically acknowledged by every segment of mankind, of all of his creatures. Okay, great, we get it, right? There's one thing of gold, there's lights that come together, there's a reflection of something that in the flame, in each flame, we reflect the connection between matter and spirit, because as Rav Shagar points out in his book about Chanukah, if in the korbanot, the point is to burn the korbanot, to make them into nothing, to kind of inspire in ourselves a mood of annihilation, of bitul atzmi, of canceling ourselves, unmaking ourselves in front of God, then when we light the candles, it's a very different mood that we evoke, because we no longer just, the point is not burning the oil. When you light a candle, you're not interested in the oil being gone. That's just a consequence. That's just a side effect. What you're interested in is in energy being produced, right? So in that regard, Rav Shagar says it's a better reflection of the way the human soul exists in the world, because the human soul and our life force consumes us. We all live out our material resources. We consume ourselves in that regard until we die. But the fact that we're slowly, forgive the grim note, the fact that we're all slowly dying throughout our lives, that's not the point. That's just the side effect. The point is the soul. The point is the life that comes out of it. So we take this lamp, this menorah, that's one. We take the menorah, that's one, and we light candles and try and make it into one light, and we represent how we bring all of ourselves into our worship of God, everything we are, and we're telling ourselves and God that we will shine bright in his service. But all of that leaves one very important question. And the question is, why is this Aaron's job? Why isn't it a job that the Levi'im do, for example? Why isn't it a job that Moshe does? Why isn't it a job that each of us does? If it's supposed to be something that inspires all of us, why shouldn't we all have little menorahs in our house and light them? And to highlight why it's a question, I mean, you could say, why is it Aaron's job to be Kohen Gadol? I mean, it's kind of obvious, it just is. The fact is that God makes a particular point to talk to Aaron here in Bamidbar Chet. Other mitzvot were not giving with this kind of particular focus. It's very clear that he's singling him out. I'm going back to the bottom of page 1 here. Daber el Aharon. It's not Daber el Aharon ve'emor lo hakohanim, your descendants. No, it's Aharon personally is the addressee of this appeal. And the pasuk then goes on to highlight his role and his compliance. If you look at pasuk Gimel, here again at the bottom of box 1, Vayas ken Aharon אל מול פני המנורה, העלה נרותיה כאשר ציווה השם את משה. In other words, out of the general discussion of rituals and Chanukah Mishkan and the arrangements for God's revelation through in the tabernacle and all that, suddenly a slightly different strand emerges, a more personal strand, a relationship moment. And suddenly God pierces the kind of general list of instruction mode to address one man in particular. And the question is why? Yes.
Well, I think also, it's not really clear what's going on here, because it says, when you go to the Neivot, then the Neivot will do this. There's no instruction here. But then the next person says, it's not clear what he's actually being instructed to do. It's being told about what will happen.
So, sorry, what's your name?
Michael.
So Michael is pointing out that there's something almost avoidant. I don't know if that's necessarily the best adjective, but I'll go with it for now. I'm using my words, not yours, sorry. But in the description here, because it's not God says, tell Aaron to do this and that. It says, when you raise the candles, ha'alotcha, which here was translated as mount the lamps. I don't like this translation. I'll explain why in a minute. When you raise the candles, they should light kind of el mul pnei menorah. Their light should be towards. So I would say that there's two layers of lack of direct instruction here, two avoidances here. One is that he's not saying light the candles this way. Like he says, when you light the candles, this is already assumed that it's done. And then he says, this is how it should be. They should light like this, not you do this. And I'm really grateful you brought it up, Michael. Yeah,
Yes.
Because I think it strengthens the question. Why is God addressing Aaron? And when he's addressing him, why is he addressing him in this way? Why is he not just telling him in the same way? He says, Moshe, do this and this. Leviim, do this and this. Nesiim, do this and this. Aaron, when you do this, this is how it should be. In a sense, both assuming that he's going to do it instead of telling him, and leaving it in his hands, not giving him an imperative instruction, but rather leaving it in his hands to make sure it aligns with this vision. Yes.
This happened at the time of the dedication of the temple.
Mm-hmm.
So it came the last thing to be said about it. Zaharon, bring the light. It's the most important thing to the temple. It didn't care about all this.
Mishkan, yeah.
Present,
Mishkan.
all of them are the same.
Mm-hmm.
But if you really want to make it meaningful, light the candle.
So okay, so we'll touch upon that, upon the role of this moment in dedication of Mishkan. But let's stay with the question for a second. I want to start unpacking it a little bit, both singling out Aaron and the peculiar way in which God addresses him, as Michael showed us, by following. Just a second, okay. Yes.
Working on the data.
You're connecting it to Chata Egel, yeah. So we'll get to that. We'll touch upon that. I want to start unpacking all of that and trying and understanding that by delving into Aaron's state of mind. Because when the Tanakh, as Rabbeinu Aviva Zorenberg teaches us, when there's these moments in Tanakh that there's a crack, and instead of just a story, we suddenly meet a relationship moment where an emotion comes in, something subconscious emerges, it's an invitation to look deeper. It's an invitation to try and understand. We can't just dismiss it as, oh, it's part of the necessities of Mishkan. We have to try and understand what is the relationship that's happening here? What is happening in the relationship between God and Aaron? And Rashi already went in that direction following Midrash Tanhuma. I'm going to go to page number 2. And he sought the explanation for God's particular appeal to Aaron, for God singling out Aaron, in the connection or in the proximity between this little segment and the korbanot of the Nesiim. And Rashi, in a sense, invites us to try and look at the situation through Aaron's eyes. Here is Aaron, who has a peculiar status. He's not exactly the chieftains of Levi, but in some ways he is treated like the Nasi of Levi. For example, later when there's a attack on his leadership, and God says, okay, put all the sticks, the staffs of the Leviim in the Mishkan, and the one who should be my priest will bloom, and it's Aaron's that bloom. So from that, it seems implied that in a way he is the Nasi of Shevet Levi, even though he's not. So he's in a position of leadership, but he's also very clearly dedicated to a different path. And then he's sitting there in the Mishkan, and he's looking at all the Nasi'im coming and bringing their offerings. And I didn't bring that to text, but it's long and complicated, and they're all bringing very expensive things, and each of them is given his own moment to shine, both in terms of days, like each one on a different day, and in terms of psukim. The psukim repeat the list of their gifts, even though it's the same, and it would have been much simpler to say, and all the Nasim brought each one X, Y, Z, etc. So there's a lot of brouhaha, so to speak, around it. And Rashi says that when he looks at all of that, he feels jealous. I'll read it in his words, Be'alotcha, in the top of box 2. Lama nismecha parashat hamenorah leparashat hanesiim? Why is a section treating the candelabra put in juxtaposition with a section dealing with the offerings of the princes? Because when Aaron saw the dedication offerings of the princes, he felt distressed because neither he nor his tribes was with them in the dedication. Whereupon the Holy One, blessed be he, said to him, by your life, your part is of greater importance than theirs, for you will kindle and set and order the lamps. Now, so this is a good, I think it takes us in the right direction, right? It points us towards trying to understand the uniqueness of the appeal by looking at what Aaron is experiencing. But as Rav Medan, following the Ramban here, points out, something here doesn't quite add up. First of all, the problem isn't clear. If the problem is jealousy, what grounds does Aaron have to be jealous? What does it mean he wasn't with them in Chanukah Mishkan? He's about to be working in the Mishkan for the rest of his life, and his children will too, and his grandchildren will too, and nobody else will. They should feel jealous. The Nasim should feel jealous that their contribution is on this one grand moment, and that's it. Now it's done. Now it's no longer an area they're allowed to even enter fully. Why is Aaron jealous all of a sudden? What is he not aware that he's going to have a greater share in the Mishkan than they do? Is he unclear about that after all the other instructions and this consecration for it, etc.? How does that make sense? And even, let's say he's jealous, how does getting the menorah somehow supposed to be the consolation prize that makes everything okay? At the same way, God could say, you're bringing all the offerings. You're going to do the Ketoret. You're going to go into Kodesh HaKodashim, right? Why is it the menorah in particular that's somehow supposed to answer this psychological need? I think these are solid questions. I mean, it really is. When I read it as a girl, like in school, this Rashi, it all made perfect sense to me. Oh, of course he's jealous, but revisiting it as an adult, when I already am aware that different people fulfill different roles and have different contributions in life, I'm like, okay, I mean, like, look, I'll be honest with you. I'm a little bit jealous of soldiers who get to fight for Israel right now, but I'm doing what I can elsewhere. So it's kind of ridiculous to focus on jealousy in that regard. If you're doing your part and I'm doing my part, then why am I jealous? Why is jealousy entering into this? And this problem invites us to try and reinterpret Rashi in a sense.
Can I ask a question? I just, I'm sorry. What I hear from Aaron, like, I guess this midrashim that say he would bring shalom bayit between people and stuff. I just don't see him as a person that would be, I mean, it's a normal feeling, but I don't see him as someone who would be getting jealous. They don't present him that way.
Okay, so you're saying that it doesn't seem, sorry, we were all very startled because it's just the sound is not calibrated, but you're raising a very important question, really, since if we're doing if our job today is to psychoanalyze Aaron a little bit, how does that moment of jealousy fit with his normal image as someone who's pursuing peace between people and is kind of selflessly pursuing other people's interests, etc.? I mean, look, the simple answer is just that people are complicated. You know, we can do certain things at our best moments, but not always live up to it in our emotional life. The other thing I want to say is perhaps it's not really so different. Perhaps in order to be able to go between people and do peace work between them and understand them, you need to understand their vulnerabilities, which means you need to be in touch with your own vulnerabilities. And we'll touch upon that later. We'll get to his unique personality in that regard later. So I'll hold it for now. For now, I want to suggest that we dig one layer deeper. Okay, so Rashi introduces the idea following an ancient midrash that there's a moment of jealousy, or I should say that jealousy is my word. The word here is chalsha azdato, is a feeling of weakness, a feeling of sadness, a feeling of discomfort, of some distress of some sort. So Rashi says there's a distress. The reason for the distress and why this is the answer for the distress are not clear yet. So Ramban digs one layer deeper. And Ramban says it's not enough to say he's jealous of them bringing their gifts. We need to understand what's the difference, the fundamental difference between their gifts and what he's going to do. And what Ramban suggests is that the big difference, the big the big gap between what he does and what the Nesi'im do is that they're bringing gifts of their own choice. If you look at the Ramban here, it's in box 2. I'm not going to start from the beginning. I'm going to start from the 3rd paragraph of the Ramban, the one that has a bold line in it. If you reply that he was disheartened because his offerings were obligatory and he had been commanded to bring them, and therefore he was dispirited because he did not bring a voluntary offering for the dedication of the altar as they did. In other words, and here I'm following the interpretation of Rav Medan on this particular Ramban, Aaron HaKohen is looking at his fellow leaders, and what he sees are people who are called upon to use their creative powers, their initiative, their power of choice, and bring the best they own, the best they want to bring, as they see it. In other words, they're lo mitzuveh ve'oseh, right? They're not commanded, and yet they do. They need to bring something, but they choose what to bring. They're exercising the, if you will, the Avrahamic part of their soul, the giving, creating, chesed part of their soul. And here he is, utterly tied up in all these rules that tell him exactly how to bring the offering, exactly when, in what way, how to go about it, where to go about it. And it just brings home that what he's called upon to do is exercise the Yitzchak attribute of Gvura, of holding back, of submission. And there's no room for him to create. There's no room for him to bring something beyond that. Now, this difference between Aaron, or this inhibition upon Aaron's creativity, goes deeper. If we want to look again at his own history, and somebody brought up Chet HaEgel here, so this is where it comes in. The one time Aaron was put in a position of leadership where he had kind of carte blanche to just lead the people as he sees fit, he messed it up. The people were told, while I, Moshe, am up in the mountain, go to Aaron and Hur if you have any problems. And when the people come to Aaron with their desire for him to create a new thing to replace Moshe and lead them, he messes it up. He's not able to stand firm. Now, he's not helping them gladly. He's not going along with it. He's trying to push them off. He tells them, bring me your wife's earrings, in the hope that their wives wouldn't let them have the earrings. He says, oh, let's do it tomorrow, in the hope of pushing them off again. He's trying to carefully negotiate some sort of compromise that will mitigate the horror. But it turns out, in retrospect, that that was just the wrong tactic at that moment. I would say more than that. You brought up in the Zoom before the issue of him being Rodef Shalom, right? There's these beautiful descriptions in the Midrash, in Masechet Avot and in Midrashim that are tied to it, about how exactly Moshe went about it. sorry, Aaron went about it, right? There's the famous story that kids learn in school that he would go to Levi and say, oh, Shimon is really sorry. And he'd go to Shimon and say, Levi is really sorry. But another story that I find very moving is that if he saw someone who was a sinner, the way he inspired them to change was by befriending them. And then once, let's say you're a sinner and you become friends with Aaron a Cohen, you start being embarrassed. You're like, oh my God, if Aaron knew what's in my heart or what I do behind closed doors or behind closed tent flaps, whatever, he would not want to be my friend. So I better be worthy of this friendship. And by doing that, by kind of generously sharing his care, his love, his friendship, he inspired people to draw closer to him and through him to God. And it seems that in Chet HaEgel, he was employing the same tactics. He was trying to bring the people to him. He wasn't trying to be harsh with them, confrontational with them. He was trying to use his Derkei Shalom, but it led him and the people astray into a devastation that cannot be overstated. A moment after getting the Torah, a moment after making the covenant, they break it. And that's a moment we haven't recovered to, according to the Midrash, to this day. We're still paying for it in installments all the time. So imagine the level of guilt and trauma that Aaron carries with him when he thinks about that moment. In fact, in the Midrash, this trauma keeps resurfacing. There's all these stories about Aaron praying for the fire to come and take the offerings and then feeling that maybe he's not worthy because of the egel and fearing that it's not going to happen. The Midrash clearly is preoccupied with this guilt and anxiety that it assumes Aaron must have experienced, even though it's not expressed in the Pshat anywhere. So when Aaron is standing there and he sees all the Nesi'im taking initiative, it rubs it in that when he took initiative, it went badly, and now he's no longer allowed to. Let's take it another step. Bamidbar, when we hear about Chanukah Mishkan Bamidbar, is a happy occasion. But the truth is that this is the second time we hear the story of Chanukah Mishkan. The first time we hear the story is in Sefer Vayikra, where it should have been a happy occasion, where there was this enormous buildup, and the fire of God came upon the altar, and the people were happy as they fell upon their faces. And in that moment, the sons, the two eldest sons of Aaron, took initiative and brought a foreign fire that they weren't commanded to bring, and died for it. And the moment of happiness, the moment of joy, became a moment of mourning. A mourning such that Aaron, all he could do was be silent in the face of it. So this just, again, adds another layer of trauma and another layer of loss to this experience when he's looking at other leaders taking initiative and doing things. And it's, it's right now they're doing things like bringing korbanot, but bringing matanot, but it's just a representation of the kind of leadership they have to exercise all the time. Every day they go and solve the problem of their tribe. One day they will lead their tribes into Israel, or not them, but we don't know it yet, etc., etc. They're the people who are busy with the job of managing life from a position of leadership. And Aaron is looking at all of that from his confined place within the very rule-bound Mishkan. And what he sees is what he cannot do, what he failed to do, what his sons were killed for doing, which is taking initiative. I can tell you from a personal perspective that I find this moment very resonant as now everything changed, but as a second generation Israeli, I was often very jealous of my parents for making the heroic choice to come and fight for the right to be here. And I often felt that it's not fair because I grew up with their example, like fighting the Soviet Union in order to make it to Israel and, taking initiative, changing their lives. And all I'm left with, that's how I felt, were the crumbs of following in their footsteps, like a loyal Yitzchak to their heroic Abraham. So, as an adult and definitely with the situation right now, my perspective on what my generation's challenges changed. But the feeling is intimately familiar to me. And I think that is the feeling. It's this feeling of being deprived of something That's such a big part of human existence, which is being creative, taking initiative, shaping the world around you as you see fit, doing your best to make an impact in your own image on the world. And that is the chulshat nefesh. That is a chulshat dat. That is the moment when Aaron feels weakness. However, just a moment, okay? I'll continue a little bit and then I'll reopen it for discussion. However, if that is how we understand the problem that's being answered with the menorah, the answer becomes inexplicable. Because if the problem that Aaron is experiencing is that he wants to take more initiative, that he's sad about not having a place for his initiative, how is the menorah supposed to be a better way? Does it solve any of his anguish? As Ramban says, I'm going to continue here, still in the third paragraph, after the part that's in bold. This cannot be so, because the lighting of the lamps with which he consoled Aaron was also a duty which he had been commanded. I'll say even more than that. Let's go back to box number 1, to the source and Baalotcha at the bottom there. If we look carefully at the wording here, we will see that from Pasuk Gimel and Dalet, the Psukim, if anything, highlight the dutifulness of Aaron, the fact that he is following instructions exactly. If you look at Pasuk Gimel, Vayas ken Aharon, ta-ta-ta, kasher tziva Hashem et Moshe. So the response to this gift, this answer to his needs, is obedience. It's another Yitzchaki moment, if you'll accept my terminology here, of just doing exactly as he's told. So if the problem is that he wants more initiative, if the problem is that he wants to bring more of himself into his pursuit of God, into his worship of God, how is getting the opportunity to light the candles of the menorah at all an answer to his needs? And I think that perhaps Michael's question from before starts showing us one possible path for an answer. Because when we look carefully, and here we're going to try several paths, I'm opening it up, it's not one path, but if we look carefully at the wording in Pasuk Bet, I'm still at box 1 at the bottom, as Michael pointed out, God doesn't say light the candles and do this and this and this. He says, as you raise the candles, this is how it should be. It's almost as if he's opening a tiny gap for initiative, a tiny gap, a tiny invitation, not a big place, because you still have to do it, and this is how it's supposed to be. But you're not told to do it. You're told this is how it should be, and now it's your choice to make it so. You have to take that last step. So that's one way to look at it. I'll be honest, I feel like that's a very small consolation, because it's kind of like when I tell my kids, the room really needs to be organized before you can watch that video. I mean, yeah, obviously I'm letting them come to the conclusion that it's worth it for them, but the condition is clear. I mean, I'm still controlling the situation. So it's still empowering. It's still different than telling them, you go put your shoes in the closet. It's less micromanaging. There's an invitation, but it's not exactly a broad open field for initiative and creativity. I think you would agree with me. So I want to go back to the question, and I want to raise it to you. How does the menorah answer Aaron's desire for initiative? Anybody wants to venture an attempt? Start working towards an answer together. Maybe I'll share Rava Mital's answer to start our creative juices flowing. Rava Mital, in an article that you can find in the Haaretz, I didn't bring it, in the Haaretz Yonah site, suggests that the menorah's work is special because you have to lay the candles anew every day. In other words, it's not a continual kind of process. Every day you have to clean it up, do the whole thing afresh, starts a new creation. So in a sense, what God is telling Aaron is, yes, what you do is limited, what you do is inhibited by certain rules, but you're still getting a role that requires you to do something new every day. It's a new beginning. It's an invitation to see the novelty or the creativity, the originality within the prescribed. Again, a small invitation, a small scope, not a wide open field, but still it's there. Anybody wants to raise a different option? Yes.
I mean, maybe it's just like what you said, maybe it's the cycle, and that's sort of giving into on this idea of forgiving yourself.
I'm sorry, can you elaborate? I'm not sure I understand.
As in every single day, like, they come down, and again, it's a renewal experience every single day, it reminds for herself, it's tormented by the past. People, really focusing on the physical level, so that you can focus on the soul.
I like the therapeutic element of that. So you're saying, I'm just repeating so we're all on the same page, that in a sense, by inviting him, it's almost an invitation to experience a moment of renewal on a daily basis, which might help him heal himself and his own trauma and guilt that he can't let go of over the golden calf. And by doing it on the physical level, there's a certain healing that happens emotionally. That I really like how aligned this is with what we know now in terms of therapy, in terms of psychology, that doing things with our body, in our body, helps us move forward in our soul and our mind. And I want to expand a little bit on that idea and say that if we look at the lighting of the candles less as an immediate answer to Aaron's need, meaning you wanted more freedom, here's more freedom, but rather as an invitation to think, to meditate about what it means to do something new, what it means to do something original, it opens a lot of interpretational possibilities. And we'll go in that direction in a second. Did anybody want to venture something? Yes.
Like a flame, even though it's supposed to, okay, well, go in one direction, you really don't have total control over it. The light itself is something new and a little different in the way it works every time. So there is something, again, renewing in the very flame itself.
I like that. You're saying that, I'll repeat it for the Zoom also. You're saying that, yes, he's supposed to organize the light so they point in a certain direction, but at the end of the day, fire has its own life, in a sense. And that goes back to fire, to our theme of fire, that fire, I mean, you control it as much as you can, but at the end of the day, it will burn as it wishes. If you can talk about wishes in an inanimate object, but you understand what I'm saying, right? That you light the fire and then the flame will go somewhere. So it's an experience where Aaron is creating something new that goes beyond his intentions. And if again, we use the language of invitation to reflect, invitation to meditate, it invites him to acknowledge that, yes, he's doing the same things every day and the same rituals, but each one of them opens doors. Every offering of chatat that he enables a person in Israel to bring opens doors for repentance that go beyond the boundary of the ritual that's more strictly regulated. Did someone want to say something on the Zoom?
What about the
Yes.
don't know who wants to speak first. It's be my guess.
Rachel, I had a suggestion,
Yeah.
a possibility. If indeed Aaron's response to not having the same opportunity as the Nesiim had of using their creativity, if that is what drove him to feel badly, in the end, the Nesiim ended up bringing all the same korbanot, but their expression of individual creativity was in their own personal wishes or aspirations, or as it wasn't in the physical, it was in what they brought individually to that korban. So in the end, if perhaps that's related to this lack of creativity that we might see in the job of Aaron as lighting the menorah. It's not really the end result or the product, it's what's being put into it as an individual.
Okay, that's a really interesting comparison. Thank you so much for bringing it up. I will refer to it in a second. I'll touch base with that in a second.
Yes, I just wanted to say that you're talking about the light all the time, but maybe Aaron was given the chance to be the sole lighter of the menorah, because he was going to have the initiative to create the menorah as a symbol of something, as a new symbol of something.
well, he wasn't the one creating it. Moshe was the one who created, like.
Okay, but once he had the menorah and he was the one who was lighting it, maybe he was the one who was going to give the menorah a symbol, a greater meaning as
Yes,
such.
I
And
see.
it was his initiative.
So I think that there's two things in what you're saying. One is that he is kind of the makebe patish, right? He's like, once the menorah is there, he's the one who gives it meaning by acting it. To say that choosing what it symbolizes, I think, is perhaps I would have to try and think how it fits with the pshat. I'm not sure I can anchor it.
It's because, I mean, the menorah today, how do we regard it today? I mean, the menorah we're talking about, of course, is the Chanukah menorah, because we all think in those terms, not in the terms of the temple menorah, which is slightly different.
Yeah, so we'll get to the Chanukah in a bit. So thank you very much for the comment. I apologize. It's just hard because there's some incalibration and the sounds, but we're all trying to be in the same conversation at the same time. Let me try and collect a little bit some of what was said and focus it in something in particular. I want to say that a lot of you basically kind of brought up different variations on the idea, in a sense that God isn't simply answering a need, like, oh, I want more money, here's more money. I want more initiative, here's more initiative. God is participating in a conversation here. In other words, Aaron's distress, which by the way, he didn't express, I mean, but God, ro'ela levav, right? Sees into the heart. There's a distress that expresses a desire. And the desire is not a bad thing. The desire to take initiative in God's service is a great thing. We're supposed to have this desire. God doesn't want to tamp it down. But it's almost as if he's inviting Aaron to consider how this desire can work within the life he's supposed to live. In other words, if the job of Aaron is to take all the lights and direct them to the middle, so all the different powers of the man, of a woman, of a human being, and the different powers and people within a nation are somehow focused on God, God is almost inviting him to do the same, to say, your power of creativity that's right now is unexercised. How do you bring that into this unity in the right way? How do you weave it into this light that your job is to raise up, when you raise it, when you allow it to rise up? And Rashar Hirsch in particular has a very interesting interpretation on what it's meant to represent, on how the candles or lighting the candles are meant to be a reflection or an invitation for Aaron to understand his own role better. And I have to say that Rashar Hirsch doesn't talk about it in relation to this whole midrashic tradition of Aaron's distress of lack of initiative. He talks about something different, but it just comes together very naturally. Because the way the Rashar Hirsch sees it, the mitzvah that Aaron is given is actually not lighting the candles. In that he follows the Rambam, by the way, who thought that anyone can light the candles of the menorah. The mitzvah that the Kohen Gadol is given is to prepare them. He's supposed to lay them out, to lay the lamps in the right way, so they're all pointing in the right direction, so they're all ready to be lit. And B'shat Adchak, Rambam says, anyone can light it. Bezal. It just that's not the important part. And the Rashar Hirsch takes it a step further and says, why? What is it that Aaron is supposed to do? Aaron's job is to make sure that there's fire, but he's not controlling the fire. Even when he lights it, the way he's supposed to light it is that teheh shalhevet ola me'aleh, that the flame needs to kind of rise almost on its own, out of its own volition. Now, it has technical ramification on lighting from the bottom of the teal and then the flame goes up, but it's a deeper gesture, because the gesture here is a gesture of ceding control, not of controlling. And if we're talking here about Aaron's desire to impact reality, God, in a sense, is inviting him to impact reality by ceding control on reality. within a particular context. And that context is the context, as Rashar here says, I'm going to box number 3. It's the context of education. Aaron lights the candles or prepares them and allows someone else to light them because his main job is not just as a man dealing with ritual details. His main job is to be an educator, is to be someone who brings the light of God, the light of knowledge to the people, both symbolically in the menorah, but much more importantly, through sharing Torah knowledge. This was the original role, the original mission of all Kohanim. As Rashar here says here in the second source, at Bnei Israel, just to clarify, he's talking here about why whatever. It's just on a different pasuk, which I didn't bring, but let's just read it. Limud Torah, learning Torah, יהיה עניינה הכללי של האומה כולה. Is meant to be the matter, the interest of the whole nation, ולא עניין מיוחד של כת כהנים, not just the special interest of a cult of priests. המנורה מסמלת את עץ החיים של רוח האומה כולה. The menorah symbolizes the tree of life of the spirit of the whole nation. רק הטבת הנרות היא עבודת כהונה. Only fixing the lights, preparing the candles, is the work of the priest, meaning אספקת צורכי המאור יום יום והדאגה למצבם התקין של הנרות, supplying what's necessary every day and taking care of the state of the candles, ואילו ההדלקה עצמה לאו עבודה היא. The lighting is not the work. להעלות נר, לשון זה של הדלקת נר אינו המקרא אלא לגבי עבודת המנורה. הווה אומר, תפקיד מלמד התורה הוא לעשות את עצמו מיותר. Rashar here, and I realize that it's a little bit out of context, but I'll give you the context. He's talking about the way the lighting is supposed to work. The way the lighting is supposed to work is by making the person lighting it as unimportant as possible. We're trying to light it in the minimal touch from the bottom and then let go and allow the flame to acquire its own life, kind of along with what you said before. The flame needs to go its own way because the symbolic gesture is not just, as you said before, a gesture of renewal. It's not just a gesture of creativity within bounds. It's a gesture of allowing light to spread. And the real educator, and Rashar Hirsch goes at length, I didn't want to bring the whole text, but Rashar Hirsch goes more at length about it. The real educator isn't someone who's going to handhold his student for the rest of his life. The real educator lights the fire and steps back. And his success or her success is in no longer being necessary and becoming superfluous to the person's internal light of learning and truth and drive, etc., etc., etc. So when Aaron is feeling distress at not being allowed to create, not being allowed to take initiative, not being allowed to bring the dava and decide what is most precious to him, God isn't giving him an opportunity to be creative. He rather invites him, if we read it from this perspective, from this prism of Rashar Hirsch's words, he invites him to understand that in his work that he will do, his restraint, his ability to kind of push a little and then pull back is going to be crucial in making the world a better place. In other words, God is both telling him you will have scope for creativity because education requires creativity, but a lot of the creativity will come into expression in withdrawal. In that space, that Michael pointed out to us, that's created when you start the process and you know where it's supposed to go, but I'm leaving it to you how to allow it to become that. Yes.
That's really sort of the role of a parent when you're trying to teach a child to know just when to push and when to hold back and when to how to encourage without doing it for them.
Yes, you're comparing it to parenting, and as a parent of young children, I can relate very well that it's it's a challenge. It's very easy to overrun your child and force them to, well, it's not easy. Theoretically, it's easy to force your child to do things, but it's much harder to inspire your kid to have the drive to do it themselves. And it's ironic, isn't it, that in order to encourage drive and creativity in other people, you need to hold back your drive and creativity. And that's exactly that tension. That's the tension that Aaron is called upon to live in. He's not giving an out. God doesn't tell him, oh, okay, you wanted to be like the other Nassim, never mind, you're not Aaron a Kohen anymore, you're Nasi Shevet Levi. No, you're in a role and the role requires something, but he's allowing him to understand the importance and the greatness, in a sense, or inviting him to understand better the importance and the greatness of what he's called upon to do. And I want to add another two kind of layers to this realization, or to this gift that God is giving to Aaron. One has to do with our understanding of what leadership is. When Aaron is looking at the Nasi'im and he's feeling dismayed and disheartened, what he sees are people whose leadership requires them to take charge, to take initiative. And he feels that he failed in the one big time that he was expected to do that, and therefore he's not worthy, he can't do it, something is wrong with him. But in a sense, God is inviting him not simply to re-understand what his role is, he's also inviting him to understand that there's many forms of leadership. And the leadership of the educator is no less important. It's just very, very different, the leadership of the parent. Rabbi Sachs, in an article in Parashat Ba'alcha, where he is actually not talking about that at all. He's talking about Moshe Rabbeinu's leadership. But he makes a distinction that I find bears also upon Aaron's situation here, where he makes a distinction between the leadership of power and the leadership of influence. And Rabbi Sachs points out that both are necessary. We need prime ministers or kings, or somebody needs to take charge. If you go into battle and there's not one person giving the orders, then I'm sorry, but it's not going to end very well for you, right? You need leaders of power. But the Torah is extremely ambivalent about leadership of power. It's not happy with leadership of power. It's a compromise in the world to need people in power. The Torah is much more positive about the leadership of influence, where the idea is that you affect people by teaching them, by inspiring them, by doing good things to them. And one of the reasons that this is actually a preferable form of leadership, as Rabbi Sachs points out, is that it works by multiplication. As he says here in box number 4, power works by division, influence by multiplication. Power, in other words, is a zero-sum game. The more you share, the less you have. Influence is a non-zero-sum game. The more you share, the more you have. In a different place, Rabbi Sachs brings an example. He says, let's say you have power in a country. Imaginary scenario, everybody has to do what you tell them. And now you give the same power to 9 more people. So now there's 10 people who everything they say, people have to listen to them. That diminishes your power, because if one of them says something that contradicts what you said, then there's a conflict, there's a problem. It leads to divisions. Whereas if I have an idea and I share it with 10 people and then they go on sharing it, that just means that there's so many more, it just amplifies my original idea. So influence works like that. It reminds me of something that my kindergarten teacher taught me in Chanukah when I was a young girl, where she pointed out to us that when you light a candle from one candle to another, you don't need to extinguish the first candle. Fire spreads, you can spread light and fire without diminishing what you share. It's not a finite resource in that regard. The oil is, the ptilim are, but the fire isn't. So in that regard, Aaron is told, yes, you're not assuming a position of power. You're not going to be a leader in that sense. You're not. Your goal is different, but it's no less important, because your job is to influence, to educate, to raise. And there's no limit to the impact you can reach. There's no divisions in it. There's nothing stopping you from changing the world, so to speak. But I want to add another layer. I'm sorry, I'm going to go to the last page. Page 4, box 5. And point out, and here we're coming really full circle to our discussion earlier of Aaron's particular attributes and the way he made peace between people. I want to point out that by illuminating his role as an educator, as a leader of influence, as someone whose job is to start the lights and then let them grow, and restraining himself from over controlling them. God is not just ennobling Aaron. He's not just telling him, oh, but your job is also important. Kind of like you say, I would say to one of my children, I know you have a different share, but it's also important. It's also good. It's not just that. He's also inviting Aaron to pursue a role that's much more suited for his psyche, for his soul. Because in the moment when Aaron was called for leadership, strong, antagonistic, powerful leadership, and by Mount Sinai, at the moment of the Egel, he failed. God is not telling him, okay, you failed, next time you'll succeed, try again. He's telling him instead, maybe the reason you fail, and I'm reading a lot into it, but I think we can agree on that. You failed because your soul's tendency doesn't align with this sort of leadership. So maybe the tikkun is not to try and do it again and again and again, but rather to understand where your soul does align, where your tendencies actually can be a point of strength and not a point of weakness that you all constantly need to try and overcome. And when you try and place Aaron in the context of an educator, of a raiser, uplifter of men, suddenly his soft-spokenness, his vulnerability, his willingness to generously share of himself, his willingness to lie for the purpose of peace, to tell someone, oh, your friend misses you, even if he doesn't. Suddenly, all of that becomes a source of strength, because this is exactly the kind of tools you need when you negotiate the fine line between forcing someone into something and empowering them to achieve it for themselves. And in that regard, Aaron's influence, Aaron's work extends far, far beyond his achievements as a man, or as a Kohen, or as someone whose job was restricted to the rituals of a mikdash, because he creates for us, for all of us who have to educate and raise and uplift, a model to this day, as a Mishnah Avot says in the middle here of box 5, Hillel v'Shammai kiblu mehem, Hillel omer, heve mitalmidav shel Aaron, ohev shalom v'rodef shalom, ohev et habriot u'mekarvan laTorah. We're not all the sons of Aaron, but we're all called upon to emulate the man whose job wasn't to create something new in the world, but rather to take other people's powers, the shared pool of everybody's powers and sources and yearnings and cravings, and help them bring it together into their worship of God, and then allow their light to rise. Now, I want to tie it all to Chanukah, but first I want to open it to comments and questions. Yes?
In a way too, in terms of zero game and not a zero game, this idea of the educated, it's also, you can say that love of Aaron and for the nation was also not a zero-sum game. You add the lights of the menorah, and you can also add each time you don't just love one tribe, you love every tribe, and it's the same thing. It spreads.
Correct. I absolutely agree. Love works on the same principle, and Aaron is a representative of love, of shalom and ahava, and it's a beautiful lesson and a model for us beyond temple. It's like I said, we all Talmidei Aaron, even if we're not all Bnei Aaron. Any other comments before we bring it into Chanukah? Yes.
Going back to the beginning when you said wise and menorah.
Sorry, can you speak up?
Going back to the beginning when you said wise and menorah made one piece of gold. So I'm getting this idea that you've got this form, this very prescribed form that we have, or formula that we have to stick to. We all come from the same source, we're all aiming to the same end, but within there are many different ways within the prescribed formula of expressing individuality, whether it's the capital name of Brachim, whether it's the way that the fire goes off in its own different, and within Judaism, we have the ability to express ourselves, but within this specific idea.
Yes, I think that you're right, that the menorah and its light offer us a model or a metaphor that's very useful for us when we try and understand our individual place within the Jewish path. because it says we're all coming from the same source, we're all aiming to the same goal, but within it, there's the sky is the limit, so to speak, in terms of what we can be. And I think that's a powerful image, a useful image for sure. One last comment, anybody? And
Rachel, this is Ellen.
yes, Ellen.
The sky's the limit. Did you hear the thunder last night?
Yes. Yes.
No.
Thunder.
The heavens are telling the glory of God.
Yes, I agree. The heavens are telling the glory of God, and the thunder of the jets in the air is telling the glory of Israel. And there's an echoing going.
I think he was excited. Hashem was excited because you were going to teach today.
Thank you, Alan. You're so sweet. Okay, so let's on that embarrassing.
Well, I have one small point.
Sure.
I think it's Emma Hertzberg. I think our first introduction to Aaron is that as one of a facilitator, where he actually facilitates Moshe to be a leader. So, when Hashem appoints him and says, Aaron, achicha yeh neviecha, that kind of sets him up already to be, to be able to empower Moshe.
Correct, absolutely. That from the moment where he's introduced into the story, he's already introduced in that role of a connection, of someone who understands people, who can speak with them, and who can connect between the truth Moshe represents and the needs of the people. And it makes sense that he's a person of vulnerabilities himself to be able to negotiate that space. I want to take everything we said kind of and set it aside for a second and see how we carry it into Chanukah with us, okay? The Ramban I read in the beginning that was trying to understand why Aaron is upset and how the menorah is an answer, actually offers a different answer. And we don't have time to read it in the text, you can look later. Ramban suggests that, and he's following an ancient secret tradition in Megillat Rabbeinu Nissim, that really the menorah is not the answer to Aaron's question. The menorah is just a hint that one day down the line, don't worry, Aaron, one day down the line, your descendants will get the opportunity to act with initiative and creativity and take charge, just like the other Nasim are doing now and you're not. And those descendants will be Beit Hashmonai. The descendants of Aaron who had to step past the priestly roles of education and influence and ritual and take the tools of war and the tools of kingship into their hands and shape reality anew. And in that regard, he says that the fact that these two stories are in juxtaposition, the Nasi'im and the menorah, it's not an answer in Aaron's time. It's a hint to history. It's almost like a prophecy. It's a moment of prophecy or a spoiler. You call it Easter egg in narrative. There's a term in movies, Easter egg, meaning like something in a movie. It's not really it has nothing to do with Easter. It's just the idea is that there's something in the movie that hints what will happen in the sequel. So it's like a hint that there will be a sequel where Aaron's descendants will get to carve the world in the leadership of power. To me, this answer is very uplifting, but also somewhat sobering, because Beit Hashmonai exemplified to us very clearly the problems with leadership of power. They show us both why you need it, because when the Greeks come and tell you to stop worshiping God, you kind of need someone to take charge and initiative and fight back. But they also show you how easily this leadership can be corrupted, because within a few generations, the house that rose in the name of Mila Hashem Elai became Hellenized completely and broke apart the land, like broke Israel into something very weak and invited Rome, our great destroyer, into our story. So it's a sobering reflection, the idea that yes, there will be descendants of Aaron that one day will stand up. It's a sobering reflection to realize just how dangerous it is, or just how difficult it is to assume real initiative in the world without causing damage down the line. But a deeper layer of comfort for me is that unlike many other, and like Ramban hints to that too, you can see it later in the text, unlike the korbanot, for example, which obviously do not exist anymore, right? Those aspects of Aaron's job that are related to influence and education outlast the Mikdash. And there's two examples of that. One is Birkat Kohanim, which outlasts the Mikdash, right? And that's very much the influence, the passing on God's spirit to the people, the blessing, the raising the people that Aaron's descendants continue fulfilling for us to this day. And the other, as Ramban says, is the lights of Chanukah. Because even though we are not Aaron, and we are not his descendants, and we're not the Chashmonaim, we're not from that family in particular. In our lights of Chanukah, we keep alive the light of the menorah. We remember through them the light of the menorah, and through that we remember what the light of the menorah was supposed to represent. So tomorrow night when we go home and we light the lights, the first light of Chanukah in the open spaces where the world can see, please recall, please remember with me that we're not just lighting the light of Chanukah. We're not even just lighting the light that remembers a particular miracle and particular moment in time. We are lighting the continuation of this eternal light, this eternal flame that's meant to inspire us to always rise towards God, to always direct ourselves towards God's will and to inspire others. And on that note, may we have a wonderful Chanukah filled with only good news.